Between the late 17th century and the middle of the 19th century, political power in Britain was primarily contested between two factions, the Whigs and the Tories. These two political camps represented opposing visions of governance, society, and economy. The Whigs often aligned themselves with constitutional monarchy, religious tolerance for Protestant dissenters, and, gradually, the expansion of parliamentary power. In contrast, the Tories were staunch defenders of the monarchy, the Anglican Church, and traditional hierarchies. While these alignments were not always perfectly consistent, they represented broad ideological camps that shaped British politics for generations. By the middle of the 19th century, the Whig political identity began to evolve due to internal and external pressures. New political ideas and challenges brought by industrialization, rising literacy, and social agitation led to the reconfiguration of political alliances. The Whigs, faced with the need to modernize their platform and appeal to a broader segment of society, eventually merged with two other factions, the Peelites and the Radicals. This political convergence marked the birth of the Liberal Party around the year 1859. The Peelites were a group that had broken away from the Conservative Party due to significant disagreements over economic policy, particularly concerning trade. Named after their leader, a former Prime Minister, the Peelites championed the principle of free trade, which they believed would promote prosperity, reduce prices, and integrate the British economy more effectively with the world. This position put them at odds with the dominant wing of the Conservative Party, which favoured protectionist policies. The Peelites supported repealing the Corn Laws, which were seen as benefiting landowners at the expense of urban workers and consumers. Their defection ultimately fragmented the Conservative Party for a time, with the Peelites playing a decisive role in forming the new Liberal Party. Protectionism, which the Peelites opposed, was an economic policy aimed at shielding domestic industries from foreign competition. This was typically done by imposing tariffs on imported goods, setting quotas, and enforcing regulatory barriers that discouraged the flow of imports. Supporters of protectionism believed it protected local industries, preserved jobs, and helped maintain national economic stability. They also argued that it allowed emerging industries to develop without being overwhelmed by more advanced foreign competitors. Critics of protectionism, however, viewed these policies as harmful in the long run. They argued that such barriers distorted market efficiency, inflated consumer prices, and hindered innovation. The ideological tension between protectionism and free trade remained a central feature of political debate well into the modern era. The Radicals, who also joined with the Whigs and Peelites to form the Liberal Party, were a diverse group united by a common desire for parliamentary reform and democratic expansion. Emerging in the late 18th century, the radical movement built upon earlier reformist currents and called for substantial changes to the British political system. The movement attracted individuals from different social backgrounds, including the working and middle classes. Among their goals were electoral reform, expanded suffrage, greater accountability of government officials, the reduction of taxation burdens on the poor, and the abolition of sinecures, which were well-paid positions requiring little or no actual work. Radical agitation intensified after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. As soldiers returned home to a stagnant economy and widespread poverty, popular discontent surged. The term radical, as opposed to earlier labels like reformer, came into common usage during the post-war period, particularly after the protests of 1819. One of the most notable events of this period was the gathering in Manchester that became known as the Peterloo Massacre, where a peaceful protest demanding reform was violently dispersed by local militia, resulting in multiple deaths and hundreds of injuries. A leading figure at this protest was Henry Hunt, a well-known orator who became a symbol of working-class radicalism. Hunt was elected to Parliament during the brief reform era of the early 1830s, where he advocated for electoral and economic reforms on behalf of his constituents. Radicals were not a monolithic group. They ranged from populist leaders advocating for working-class rights to philosophically inclined reformers who stressed legal and constitutional change. These differences sometimes created internal tension within the movement, but they also allowed the radicals to exert influence across a broad spectrum of society. Over time, their efforts contributed significantly to the erosion of aristocratic privilege and the expansion of democratic principles within British governance. As the Liberal Party was taking shape in Britain, Canada was experiencing its own evolution in political and legal frameworks. One of the most significant developments in Canadian constitutional history was the adoption of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This charter, a key component of the Constitution Act enacted in the early 1980s, entrenched a wide array of political and civil rights for all people in Canada. These rights applied at every level of government and were designed to ensure fairness, equality, and freedom for all citizens. The Charter was not Canada's first attempt to enshrine legal protections for its citizens. An earlier document, the Canadian Bill of Rights, was enacted in the middle of the 20th century. However, this earlier bill had limited impact, as it was not a constitutional document and applied only to federal law. Courts often interpreted it narrowly, and it had little influence on provincial legislation. Moreover, the Bill of Rights could be amended or repealed through ordinary legislative procedures, undermining its effectiveness as a tool for protecting civil liberties. In contrast, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was embedded in the Constitution and therefore had superior legal authority. It could not be changed without a formal constitutional amendment, a process requiring broad consensus across federal and provincial governments. This provided a stronger foundation for the protection of individual rights. The Charter addressed a wide array of legal protections, including freedom of expression, equality under the law, and the right to a fair trial. It also expanded the role of Canadian courts, giving them the power to strike down legislation that violated constitutional rights and to impose remedies when rights were infringed. One of the architects of the Charter was the Canadian Prime Minister during the early 1980s, who sought to modernize Canada's legal framework and align it with international human rights standards. The adoption of the Charter was part of a broader movement that began in the aftermath of the Second World War. The global horror at the atrocities committed during that conflict had sparked renewed interest in formalizing protections for individual rights. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights had laid the groundwork for a wave of legal reforms across many countries, including Canada. The Charter's emphasis on legal protections for all citizens reflected a shift away from older systems of governance where parliamentary supremacy reigned supreme. While Canada retained many features of its parliamentary tradition, the Charter introduced an element of judicial oversight that had not existed before. Judges could now evaluate laws not just on procedural grounds but also on substantive fairness. This significantly altered the balance of power between the legislative and judicial branches and introduced new mechanisms for the enforcement of rights. Though widely supported, the Charter was not without its critics. Some feared that giving judges the power to overturn legislation would erode democratic accountability. Others worried that the Charter's broad language could be interpreted in ways that were inconsistent with public values or traditional legal norms. Nonetheless, the Charter has become a cornerstone of Canadian identity and governance, celebrated as a symbol of national unity and justice. The transformation of the British Whigs into the Liberal Party was a pivotal moment in the history of political thought, marked by alliances with groups like the Peelites and the Radicals. These alliances brought together diverse views on trade, governance, and social reform, and they helped shape modern liberalism in Britain. At the same time, similar themes of legal reform and individual rights were emerging in other parts of the world. In Canada, the creation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms represented a major step toward the formalization and enforcement of civil liberties. While arising in different contexts and time periods, these developments reflect a broader historical trend, the gradual evolution of political systems from hierarchical and exclusive institutions toward more inclusive and rights-based frameworks. These transitions were not without conflict or controversy, but they marked a significant step forward in the pursuit of justice, equality, and democratic governance.